Entonces, sin más preámbulos, muchas gracias de nuevo, Simon, por acompañarnos, por aceptar nuestra invitación. Bienvenido, el micrófono es tuyo.
Good morning. Good morning. Thank you so much for that very, very kind and long introduction. It's an absolute pleasure to be here today with you from Australia. So thanks everyone for coming, despite the rain outside. If we were in Australia and it was raining like that, no one would come. So it's nice to see people here. I'd just also like to make a special thanks to Olga, Natalia, for the invitation and for hosting me this week. What I'm going to talk about today is a brief overview of the evidence of exercise and mental health. So what we know to date. I'll then talk about some specific projects that we are running in Australia, also overseas, and then we will have a more practical opportunity to work through this impact tool together. If there's any questions, I'm sorry, I don't speak Spanish. The only Spanish I can say is lo siento, no hablo español. But if there are any questions, please just put up your hand during the presentation and we can try to answer them as we go. Okay, so in Australia, first of all, has anyone been to Australia? And no. Okay, well, hopefully soon that will change and everyone can come and visit us down there. In Australia, this is the Aboriginal flag, so the Indigenous flag of our Indigenous people. And people often think that Australia is a new country because we only had white settlement for the last 200 years. But actually, the Indigenous people are one of the oldest civilizations on the whole world. And it's traditional for us in Australia to pay our respect to the Indigenous people. So the lands in which I work and live, the university, are the lands of the Bidjigal people. So I'd just like to pay my respect to the Bidjigal people and acknowledge their connection to the country. So this is a brief some photos from where I'm from in Sydney. So the University of New South Wales, that's our university. It's a little bit bigger than ECR. We have about 50,000 students at our university. So lots and lots of students. We did a nice walking tour around the campus here. Back home, to walk from one end of the campus to the other takes about 30 minutes. So it's a big campus. This beach here is one of the most famous beaches in Australia. It's called Bondi Beach. And it's about 15 minutes from our university. And you can also see the Sydney Harbour Bridge, which is a famous icon, and the Sydney Opera House. We don't have kangaroos in the city. So the biggest mistake people think is that they can land in Sydney, get a plane, and that you can ride a kangaroo. That's not the case, okay? So you have to go outside of the city to find a kangaroo. Okay, so we'll jump straight into the topic today, which is mental health. Okay, a topic very close to my heart and has been the focus of my research for the past 15 years. Okay, so I'm an exercise physiologist, so similar to your background in physical therapy and rehabilitation. That was my background as well. And then I did my PhD in post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, and I'll talk a bit about that work as we go. But the first thing I want to talk about is the distinction between mental health and mental illness, because they are two different things. And people often think that mental health and mental illness is one straight line, and that either you have a mental illness or you have good mental health. But that's not the case, okay? So we think of it like this continuum. On here, this axis, we have optimal mental health and poor mental health. Now, at any point in time, just like your physical health, our mental health differs. It changes along this spectrum, okay? Likewise, here we have mental illness. So serious mental illness, we're talking about things like schizophrenia, major depression, bipolar disorder. And then here we have no mental illness. Now, to give you an example, the time in Australia right now, I think, is about 2 o'clock in the morning. Okay, so I'm still completely jet lagged. Yeah, so I'm not sleeping very well. I don't have a mental illness, but you could say right now I'm also a little bit stressed talking to all of you. So I could say that my mental health is here. Okay, so no mental illness, I'm a bit stressed, a bit tired, and today we could say poor. And that's not actually true. I'm very excited to be here talking to you. It's just an example. But likewise, we can have someone with a serious mental illness. So let's say someone with schizophrenia. But that person is taking medication. They may be seeing their psychologist. They may be involved in a physical therapy program as well. And so at that specific point in time, their mental health is actually really good, even though they have a mental illness. So this is a really important distinction. And when we think about the evidence for exercise and mental health, it actually doesn't matter which quadrant we are in. There is evidence that exercise can help everyone, no matter where they are here. The key message, though, is that the people down this end need more support. They need the dedicated support of physical therapists, of dietitians, to help them to engage in physical activity. Now, I'm going to read this out. A lot of my pictures come from social media. And I've just blacked out that rude word, but I'll read this out to you. I'm sick of people who don't have a mental illness saying that I should exercise to help my mood. 90% of the time, I don't have the energy to shower or make food. I won't read that. So how am I going to exercise? Just shut up. Now, I'm sure people here have felt this before or have worked with patients that are feeling like this. Has anyone experienced this? Your hand? Maybe there's a couple of people. Yep. This is really, really important. It's probably the most important part of what I will say today. Yeah? And the idea is that this is true, this is valid, and we have to take this into account when we're working with people. And what I would argue is that actually the system and the structures have let this person down. Because if we had the right support in place, including, for example, physical therapists, occupational therapists, to support this person to exercise, then they could still engage. It's also really important that as health professionals, we don't simply tell people you should do more exercise. Because one of the issues there is the guilt and shame that adds to people when they don't achieve something. And exercise, we want it to be a positive, not a negative. So the question I want to now talk about is this idea about what is mental health care. And there's a couple of things that for me are really important in this picture. The first one is that we can see the body and the mind are completely separate. Now, this goes back to Descartes' philosophy and dualism and the separation of mind and body. But we know that this is completely ridiculous. It's just not true. The way we feel impacts on our physical health, and our physical health impacts on our mental health. And the evidence is very clear that it goes both ways. Okay, so that's the first thing. The second, we have the doctor standing there saying, okay, who am I treating first? Now, I don't know about the situation here in Colombia, but definitely in Australia and lots of countries that I've visited, this is the way the medical system is set up. So we have the separation. We have the mental health professionals, so our psychologists, our psychiatrists, maybe social workers, but they are working in one area. And then we have the physical health, the cardiologist, the general practitioner or primary care physician, physical therapist, and they are working at the other end and they don't connect with each other. Okay, so that's one thing that we're really trying to change. The final point that's important from this picture is if you notice the obesity here of this gentleman or this patient. Now, this isn't an accident. This is very deliberate because we know that people living with mental illness are significantly more likely to die from preventable cardiovascular disease. Okay, so what that means is just for having a diagnosis of either depression, bipolar, schizophrenia, whatever the diagnosis is, we can assume that that person is likely to have poor physical health as well. Now, ultimately, what this ends up in is a reduction in life expectancy of up to 25 years. And this is across the world. Yeah? So I'll just repeat that. People living with mental illness die up to 25 years earlier than the general population because of poor physical health. And this has been described as a human rights issue. And it's why it's so important that we have programs, including physical therapists, involved and treating people living with mental illness. So my question here, what is mental health care? Is it only talking therapy? Is it only medication? Or can this be considered part of mental health treatment? And my argument and the evidence would be absolutely that this doesn't replace existing mental health care. And that's a really important point. We're not saying here that if only people exercised, they would be cured. That's not the case at all. What we're saying is that exercise should be an added tool in someone's tool belt, or an added strategy that they can use in order to manage their mental and physical health. We know it works, we just have to help people to engage. Now, this photo was taken in Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh, which is a context that's very special to me. That's where I've been working for a few years. And this is the biggest refugee camp in the world. There are roughly 1 million Rohingya refugees that have fled Myanmar, genocide in Myanmar, across the border into Bangladesh. And this game here is a game called Chinlon, and it's a very common game in Southeast Asia. And it's essentially like volleyball, but it's played with a cane ball. I don't know if you can see, and only your feet. So for people that are good at soccer, good at football, I'm not, you would maybe enjoy watching Chinlon. It's a very, very impressive game. Now, these are some pictures of some other programs that we would argue are part of mental health treatment. These are examples. This is one of my former PhD students, Dr. Grace McEwen, at our Black Dog Institute in Sydney. And I got asked the other day, what does Black Dog mean? Not sure if anyone knows, but it actually was coined by Winston Churchill, former Prime Minister in the UK. He had depression. He suffered from depression. And he used to call his depression a black dog, because he said he felt like there was a black dog following him all the time. And so that's why the institute is named the Black Dog Institute. This is our depression clinic, where anyone being treated for depression can come and get access to supervised, individualized exercise in addition to their treatment for depression. Yeah. An important point here is that Grace is considered part of the team. So she's completely integrated into the multidisciplinary mental health team. She attends the reviews, she liaises with the psychiatrist, the psychologist, and everyone is involved. So it's that multidisciplinary approach. This is Dr. Kemi Wright providing an exercise program for young people experiencing substance use disorders, so drugs and alcohol. And we know that there can be a really significant impact of physical activity. This program here is another example in Sydney. This is for young people experiencing their first episode of psychosis. Now, psychosis is a very serious illness that needs medication. It needs antipsychotic medications. The medication is very effective, in treating the symptoms of the psychosis. So that's the delusions, the hallucinations, the disturbance in reality that people are perceiving. Unfortunately, the medication has a drastic effect on people's physical health. Okay, now within 12 weeks of starting medication, we would expect someone to gain between 7 and 9 kilograms of weight. Now, if you just think about that for a second, imagine yourself as a young person. I mean, you are young people, but just imagine that you've experienced this really severe mental illness. You found yourself suddenly in contact with a mental health service or a psychiatric service. You've taken medication that is making you extremely hungry. It's making you very sleepy. And within 3 months, you don't recognize your body because you've put on so much weight. And that's the reality for young people with psychosis. And then it lays the foundation for heart disease, diabetes, which ends up killing them. And so what we've done in Sydney is we've developed a program with a gym, a nutritionist, to intervene at day one. So as soon as a young person comes in contact with the mental health service, they get access to an exercise specialist and a nutritionist from day one. And we showed that you can prevent that weight gain from happening, which was really promising. Yoga, there's a lot of interest in yoga for mental health, and we've got some really good evidence that yoga can be a very effective modality, a very effective form of exercise for helping people recover. Some photos down the bottom here. So I've mentioned Bangladesh. I'll just quickly talk about this photo here. So these are young boys and girls attending a surfing program on the beach in Bangladesh. Now, these young people are homeless. They're living on the street. The surfing program provides them an opportunity to come together, to be mentored by older people, to talk about any problems they're having, and also allows them to then get access to things like education, food, somewhere to sleep. And so this there is an example of the power of sport and physical activity for social change, not just for symptoms, but also for social outcomes. Another example of that, here in Lebanon, in the Bekaa Valley, where there's a lot of Syrian and Palestinian refugees. This climbing program, so they built a climbing wall in the refugee camp. One of the things they are looking at is the relationship between the two communities, the host Lebanese community and the Syrian refugee community. Because they are climbing together, they are having fun together, it helps build peace between those two communities. And again, another example of the power of sport. The other really interesting thing was the gender effect. So when we talked to some of the participants, the men would tell us that they were very surprised that the women could climb just as well as the men could. And these are conservative cultures where often women can't participate. They don't have the same access. So this was a really positive story and an example of how we can change some of those perceptions and to focus on particularly women's physical activity, because we know it's so important and they don't have access typically. And finally, this picture was taken in Turkey, close to the Syrian border, where I was working with a mental health organisation looking at strength training, so resistance training with elastic bands. So we were partly teaching these psychologists how to use strength training for their own mental health, but also as a strategy that they could then help their clients that they were working with. So I know there's a lot of content here, and don't have to worry about taking everything in. This poster was from the World Health Organization, and it won't be news to anyone here as health professionals. This is going to be very, very basic. Talks about what we call the big 4 risk factors. So smoking, physical activity, nutrition, and alcohol. Now, we all know these are important for health. for cardiovascular health in particular. Yeah, this is not news to anyone, including the general public. There's pretty good health literacy about these risk factors. But cross out cardiovascular disease and add poor mental health. And the evidence is very, very strong that these modifiable risk factors are directly related to our mental health. People know they need to be exercising for their cardiovascular health, but increasingly we want the message to get through that people should be exercising for their mental health. So what is the evidence on exercise and depression? We'll start with depression. In 2016, together with a colleague from Brazil, who's a very good friend of mine, Professor Felipe Schuch, who hopefully will be working with ECR and Olga at some point. Felipe led a big study where we reviewed all the evidence about exercise and depression. And we did a big meta-analysis. We published that meta-analysis, and the New York Times wrote an article about our paper, which was really exciting. Unfortunately, though, just have a look at this image for a second. And if I take your minds back to the first image I showed from Twitter, from that person saying, "Stop telling me to exercise, I can't get out of bed," do we think that an image like this of a very fit, maybe a fitness model, running into a new dawn, into the sunlight, is this going to motivate people to exercise? Or is this going to add even more guilt, even more shame to those people that are reading this? And I spend a lot of time looking at social media, looking at how people respond to these articles. Now, this was just as Donald Trump got elected. So that first comment makes me laugh. Someone said, "If I start exercising regularly, will Donald Trump go away?" But the most important thing is this second comment. And it says, "Often a hallmark of depression is to be unable to get up and go in the first place." So while exercise is wonderful, it is difficult to implement. So it's that exact same theme, yeah, that we don't have the right support for people. We had another study looking at the prevention of depression, and this was again led by Felipe. And what we showed was that as little as 60 minutes of physical activity per week could prevent around 17% of cases of depression globally. Now, that is an enormous statistic if we think about the burden of depression, and to think that from a population level, if we just get people moving by an extra hour a week, we can prevent such a significant number of cases. But again, more social media comments, and I think this one is very on the ball. New study finds people that are able to leave the house, manage to get dressed, manage to eat, find exercise helps their depression. So in summary, we have very strong evidence that exercise is an effective component of treatment for major depression. In Australia, the guidelines for depression recommend exercise and diet as the first line therapy. And that's a really important point. So it doesn't replace things like medication or talking therapy, but it should be used for everyone as a first line therapy. And that means it has to be administered by a physical therapist or an exercise physiologist. Now, another important point here is that when we talk about physical activity and mental health, not all physical activity is as good as each other, okay? They're not all equal. We know that there are 4 different types of physical activity, and I think I've made a mistake. I know this isn't the Colombian team, but sorry about that. So we know there are 4 types of physical activity. The first one is what we call leisure time or recreational physical activity. Now, if we think about that for a second, that's a privilege. Yeah, that's a privilege of the fact that we have the money, the social capital, the financial capital to be able to participate. We live somewhere where there are footpaths, where it's safe to exercise. Yeah, so that's leisure time physical activity. Then we have occupational physical activity. We have household physical activity and transport related physical activity. Now, not all of these are good for our mental health. And that makes intuitive sense when we think about it. If you're a labourer and you're spending 18 hours working outside, we can't say that we would expect that to be good for your mental health, and it's not. Okay? So the key ones here are the leisure time physical activity and the transport related physical activity. They're the two that are related to our mental health. So for example, someone being able to walk to work or ride their bike to work, that can be beneficial. But again, that's likely a privilege because that person has the means to choose active transport. Work physical activity is actually associated with poor mental health, which again makes intuitive sense when we think about it. And there's no relationship with household activity. Now, for people that are interested in this topic, there are two papers, one on food and the mood, and one on exercise that we wrote, but these are written for children. So this was probably one of the hardest things I've ever written, because as an academic, we like to write really boring, wordy things for no reason that no one understands. But these are written in very plain language, and they're useful if you're trying to give people resources to understand why this is important. And they're freely available on the internet. Has anyone seen these images before? Possibly. I think they tell a really important story about the sort of overall point of my entire talk today. So I'll walk you through how I think about this or why it resonates with me. Firstly, let's take this person here and pretend that's people living with mental illness. Okay, so they are disadvantaged for lots of reasons, but already they're shorter than the rest, so they're already disadvantaged. The second thing is that we know they want to be involved in the game. They want to see over the fence. They want to look after their physical health. They don't want to die early. Yeah? Then we have the difference between equality and equity. Equality means giving everyone the same thing. Okay, so here you can see everyone is equal because they've all got the same thing, the same box. But we know that's not going to work for people living with mental illness who are disadvantaged. And what we need is equity, which means giving people what they need in order to succeed. Okay, so in this picture, this is equitable because the people with mental illness have got extra support. And that's how I think about our role as physiotherapists, exercise, rehabilitation professionals. Our job here is to build these boxes and create that support, that extra support that people need. And this is what the evidence tells us is so important and can work. Now, unfortunately, this is the reality. Yeah. If we think about a commercial gym, for example, how many homeless people living with schizophrenia do we see in a commercial gym? Not many. Yeah. It's also why I was so excited seeing your exercise clinic here, because that's such a strong example of what can be built for the community and what can be created. So we've got a lot of work to do to make sure that actually the most disadvantaged, the most vulnerable can participate and can play in the game. Unfortunately, a lot of our interventions, they simply benefit people who don't need it. An example of that is, I can tell you, in Bangladesh, in the refugee camp, the United Nations, when they think about sport, they think about able-bodied young men. They think about healthy young men that are competing. They don't need the support because they're going to play anyway. They will find a way to play. What we need to think about in those contexts are the people down here. Women, people living with disability. They're the ones who need the support. And so thinking in your work, who are the people that are here and how can we support them to actually participate and engage? Now, speaking of Bangladesh, I want to just briefly mention a little bit of the work that we've done and particularly focus on this word joy or enjoyment or fun. Because if we think about what is the most important thing regarding physical activity, mental health, it's enjoyment. And it's that we can actually provide something that people enjoy and they want to do. We've published a little bit of research about this, and that was the key finding. People want to participate. They recognise physical activity as an important strategy, but there is limited access. Now, one of the things that we did to try and communicate this messaging about physical activity is we developed some animations that are available on YouTube, and they're in 2 languages. So we have one in Rohingya, which is the language that the Rohingya people speak. This is set in the refugee camp, and the story is between a young girl talking to her mum. And we did that very deliberately so we could focus on women and have representation of women exercising. And the story is that the mum says to her daughter, "I feel sad, I feel stressed." And the daughter says, "Sometimes we all feel that way. And there are things that we can't control. For example, we're living in a refugee camp and it's a very difficult situation. There are things we can control, and that's things like movement, and it can still be important." And so that's the narrative or the story in that one. And then we have another example from Lebanon, from the rock climbing program that I mentioned earlier. Another video called Exercises for Everyone that is in Arabic. And these can both be found on YouTube. I can send the links later. Now, one really important question or idea is this notion that not all physical activity is going to be good. Can we cause harm? Yes, we absolutely can cause harm. And I'll tell you an example, a story from Uganda in Africa. Now, this work was done by a colleague and friend of mine, Dr. Justin Richards, who's currently in New Zealand. Now, this program was a football program for young child soldiers in Uganda. They'd had a very traumatic experience, very traumatic childhood. And they ran a football competition. And they got local men to be the coaches of this competition, which was great, really good to engage the community. Unfortunately, the coaches weren't professional coaches. They were just volunteers. What they knew about coaching football was what they had seen on TV in the English Premier League. And what that is that's the coach walking up and down the sideline, screaming and being very angry. For traumatized children, that's not going to help. Yeah? And so unfortunately, it actually made mental health outcomes worse. Now, this is a very, very important study because it shows us that we have to be very careful about how we provide physical activity. And in contexts like these, thinking about participation, that's the word we use, meaningful participation instead of competition, if we're thinking about mental health. Now, I'll shortly, we'll give everyone a couple of minutes break. This is the last project I want to talk about from Australia. And it's something that I'm very excited about, probably most excited about out of everything we are doing at the moment. This is an incredible woman named Rosanna. And Rosanna runs a charity in Sydney called Addison Road Community Organisation. Addison Road it helps people living with food insecurity. So that's people who can't afford or don't have access to food. So it's a range of people that are socially disadvantaged. It includes refugees, asylum seekers, people with mental illness, people that have come out of prison. There's a long list of people with severe social disadvantage that use Addison Road services every day. Now, we are building a gym inside Addie Road that will cater to all those people that come and use the Addison Road community. We're calling it a not gym, which is maybe a bit difficult to translate. But essentially, it's a gym that is going to look and feel nothing like a gym. And it's going to cater to predominantly women from a refugee background. This man here is named Moz, and Moz has an incredible story. He's a Kurdish refugee who came to Australia and was detained. He was locked up by the Australian government for 8 years. Now, 2,737 days he was locked up. He's finally been released. While he was in prison, Moz is an artist, but he didn't have access to paint or any art supplies. And so what he used to do was use a toothbrush and coffee to do his artwork. Now, see Moz with the toothbrush there. He's since won one of the biggest art prizes, or he's been a finalist in one of the biggest art prizes in Australia, painting only with a toothbrush. Moz, together with 3 women who recently escaped the Taliban from Afghanistan and came to Australia, together they painted this mural you can see in the background. And this mural is on the back wall of our gym, along with other artwork that they are painting for us. And so this, to me, is a really strong example of how we can create spaces that cater to the needs of the people we're trying to work with. So this is my last slide before we have a quick break. I have 4 questions that I want everyone to think about going forward, okay? And these questions are, am I a mental health informed physiotherapist or occupational therapist or rehabilitation specialist? Yeah? The first question, have I completed psychological first aid training or something similar? Yeah, so have I had any training in mental health? Second question, do I actively consider the barriers experienced by people with a mental illness? Yeah, so are we actually thinking about that disadvantaged person and thinking about how are we helping them? Are we providing the extra support? And some of those factors are the symptoms of the mental illness itself. It's also chronic pain we know is associated with mental illness, fatigue, poor physical health. These are some of the additional factors we need to consider. Number 3, is my facility psychologically safe? Now that might be a new term for people, but the idea of psychological safety is thinking about, well, let me give you an example of what's not psychologically safe. If we think about a commercial gym with a big bodybuilder lifting lots of heavy weights, and we have maybe a young, potentially a woman who's never exercised before, that environment will not be psychologically safe for that person. Putting the artwork on the walls of the people we're working with, that's an example of trying to create psychological safety and cultural safety as well. This is a prioritize enjoyment. We talked about that. It's very, very important. People need to be enjoying it. Avoid focus on how we look. Avoid focus on weight loss. It's not the primary focus. The focus is mental health outcomes. Stop measuring weight as the primary outcome. We know the evidence of exercise and weight loss. It's not very effective. If we don't change our diet, exercise is not going to help a lot with weight loss. So let's not focus on weight loss. Finally, the question it's important for everyone to think about is, do I know how and when to refer patients to specialised mental health services? Whether that's a psychologist, a psychiatrist, do we have a protocol and a plan in place to be able to refer? I think maybe we'll take a few minute break, or I'll just ask if there's any questions. You can ask them in Spanish. Oh, I need to get my headphones. Do you want to translate? Is that... Thank you.
Simon, bueno, muchísimas gracias por lo que nos has compartido hasta el momento. Es realmente pues muy importante y muy valioso para nosotros. Yo tengo muchas preguntas, pero voy a hacer dos inicialmente. Bueno, la experiencia que ustedes tienen y que tienes en investigación y en esta acción, en estas estrategias que realizan desde la salud mental, pues, ¿qué retos ustedes han encontrado? ¿Cuáles son los principales retos que encuentran cuando acceden a población vulnerable o principalmente población que no ha podido ser atendida, que, digamos, o incluso desde la población que nos mostrabas al inicio que está un poco cerrada o que no está un poco negada quizás a veces a los tratamientos o a las posibilidades? ¿Qué estrategias ustedes empiezan o cómo inician ustedes con ellos que nos puedas pues recomendar? ¿Y qué otros retos dentro de esas intervenciones o dentro de esto que han realizado pues han encontrado?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I'll answer it quickly by saying focus on the staff. So what I mean by that, whenever we have a new program or we go to a new hospital, we don't assume that everyone understands or welcomes exercise, because we have to change culture of the mental health service. Yeah, so we have to support the staff to understand why this is important and how they can be a part of it. So I'll give you an example. I mentioned the program for young people with psychosis early on. When we did that program, we put a lot of time into the staff of the mental health service. That was the psychiatrists, the psychologists, even the receptionist at the building when the patients came. And what we did for the staff is we gave them access to the same program that we'd offer the patients. Yeah, so we're trying to improve the staff's health themselves, but we were also trying to increase the knowledge, the confidence, and the skills of the staff to participate in these interventions. And the evidence from that was very, very clear that that was effective. So I would say that everywhere I go now, including in Bangladesh with the refugee work, I'm trying to focus on staff. If we have limited resources, limited time, put it into upskilling and changing the culture of the workforces. So that might seem like an indirect answer to your question, but what I would say is that the people already working with these patients, they have the answers. They don't necessarily have the skills that you have in exercise, but they know the unique needs of the population. They have the existing relationships with the population, and they can be your biggest ally and they can open the doors for you to do the work. Yeah. Does that answer the...
Gracias, sí, sí, realmente sí considero importante lo que mencionas. Ahora, pues bueno, me gustaría, con respecto a la segunda pregunta, saber qué otros retos ustedes se han encontrado dentro de estas intervenciones que pues de pronto nosotros podamos atender, bueno, anticipar, aunque no todas las circunstancias son iguales, ¿verdad? Pero pues que nos puedan servir dentro de la experiencia que ustedes han tenido.
Okay. The other thing on that I would mention, the most important thing is ask the patients. Ask the people that you're going to work with what they need. We can't assume that we have the answers. And I'll tell you a story that is funny for me at the moment. So one of the big things that I've been doing is looking at the, now no one understands this word, the peer workforce. Compañeros, is that? Yeah. So what that is people with lived experience. So for example, the women from Afghanistan, they are experts in being a woman from Afghanistan. I'm not. I have experience in exercise, but that's experience by training. They have lived experience. We need to bring those together. They're equal. They're equal. And if you can work with that lived experience and invest in that in a meaningful way, they will give you the answers. So the funny story at Addison Road, that gym we are building, I've been very focused on the peer workforce, on the lived experience. But we have just started the formal co-design process. Don't know if you're familiar with co-design. But co-design is a methodology that allows us to work together with the people that we're working with to develop something. It's very, very important. We've started the co-design process, and I keep asking about the peer workforce because I'm really excited, and to me it makes sense, it's equitable, it's empowering. And what the refugees are telling us is, no, they will come because we're doctor. And us being called doctor means that in their culture, they will listen and do what we tell them. So that's an example of we can't assume. We just have to ask, and they will tell us. You know, what I have found probably to be most important is respect and being willing to listen. And if you can do that and you create the environment where the people you're trying to help feel comfortable, they feel listened to, they feel respected, they will give you the answers.
Simon, ¿cómo estás? Un gusto, es para mí conocerte. Llevamos más o menos 4 años con la profe Olguita siguiendo tu trabajo y quiero hacerte una pregunta porque apliqué tu herramienta y porque realmente pues este trabajo cambió mi vida por completo. Entonces, quiero preguntarte en cuánto tiempo más o menos podemos lograr una capacitación del personal. ¿Por qué te lo pregunto? Yo trabajo con persona mayor institucionalizada y tengo que ver mucho con personas que no son profesionales de la salud, ¿sí? Pero que abordan directamente a la población. Es decir, la persona mayor institucionalizada, pero está la persona de la cocina, la persona que nos colabora con el aseo, y todos indirectamente están involucrados en la vida de esa persona mayor porque viven con nosotros. Entonces, ¿cómo hacemos nosotros o en cuánto tiempo o con qué herramienta más o menos podemos capacitar al personal para que todos hablemos el mismo idioma, ¿sí? Y más cuando lo que hablamos también es de una intervención intercultural, ¿sí? ¿Cómo logramos hacer esa capacitación del personal?
Thank you. Very, very kind. Okay, I think the key thing for me there is consistency. So what I mean by consistency is we often have programs that, let's say a study, and the study is funded to do a 6-week intervention, and then the money runs up and it finishes and they move out and it's gone. and everyone gets upset because it's not sustainable, meaningful change. So I think what I've learned when we're trying to change is that the consistency is most important, because it's the trust between those other professionals, and they will trust you when they see you, when you're there consistently. So that has been a really important thing for me. In terms of training them, you need to accept that not everyone will agree. So that it's picking your battles, so to speak, picking your war. You will have champions and allies. Focus on them. Use them, because they can communicate to their people. You know, for example, I've got psychiatrists back in Australia that are very big advocates. We use them, because if I talk to a room of psychiatrists, they don't care. But if a psychiatrist talks to a room of psychiatrists, they can change their view. So I think it's important that we find those champions and the allies that you can work with and support them. The other thing that we know from evidence is that often health professionals or any professional that doesn't engage in exercise themselves, so they're not active, they maybe don't eat a healthy diet, they can be the opposite of supportive. They can actually be destructive, because they often take it personally that it's an attack on them. You know, these people are coming in trying to make me do things that's not my job. I'll tell you a story. When I was doing my PhD at the hospital, so I was at a psychiatric hospital, I was the only exercise person. And for years, the nurses would be like, "Who is this person? Go away. We don't care." And I was running a program trying to get the nurses to measure waist circumference as a marker of metabolic health. And I remember it really clearly. I was doing a training like this for about 20 nurses. And I was telling them all about the importance of waist circumference and, you know, why we have to measure it. And I'm not sure about you, but sometimes when you're doing a talk, you have a feeling that this is not good. So today feels positive, but I had a bad feeling that this was not working and that they were looking at me with, we say daggers. They were sending daggers out of their eye at me. And eventually I realized that actually I was sitting in a room of 20 nurses who were not physically fit. They didn't exercise, and they felt that I was actually criticizing and attacking them. And so the way I had to work around that was to convince them and to talk to them about why this wasn't about their weight. This was actually about health and about mental health, and that the exercise wasn't just for weight loss. So I used that to engage with the staff and to change their view about what they can do in their role. And that had a big impact on the hospital. I don't know, I feel like now I'm just talking rubbish, but I guess that's the thing that I would be looking at, is identify those champions that you can focus on and ask them what they need. Ask them, what do they think about this? Because then you might find out that, you know, the cook you mentioned might say, no, I don't agree, or this doesn't make sense to me. Or you might find out that they are, you know, they run every day or something, and there's something they enjoy. Find that common ground around exercise and start there.
Well, feel this. Thanks so much for share your different experience. I have a question for you. Why did you decide to study the different effects the physical activity related to mental illness, and maybe don't decide to study the different effects the mental illness, but with different medicaments, maybe the drugs, maybe the pills? Maybe do you have any degree related to the physical, or maybe what do you decide is to be that?
Yeah, just to clarify, so you're asking about the dose, like
Yes.
the dose of exercise?
Yes.
And the impact on mental health?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, that's easy to answer. The evidence is very clear that the type of exercise doesn't matter. What's more important is the volume. Okay, so it's more important that we get people doing more minutes of activity as opposed to the type. Resistance exercise, aerobic exercise, yoga, Whatever someone wants to do can be effective. But the most important thing is that there's that internal motivation to participate.
Okay, well, another question. Do you think it's necessary know the different things at the moment they prescribe the exercise with people have mental illness, or is the same with normal person?
So so the way we approach exercise
Yes.
with someone with mental illness versus not.
Yes.
The differences would be in the level of support needed. So I will use my mum as an example. My mum doesn't like exercising. She doesn't have a mental illness, but she doesn't like exercising. I'm constantly trying to get her to exercise. It's hard. It's hard for everyone. We sometimes feel tired and there's barriers. It's understanding that and then understanding that there's additional barriers. And so part of that is changing our own expectations about what is important. So what I mean by that is we've got good evidence that as little as 5 or 10 minutes can be beneficial. So for example, in the hospital, I would often go to someone's bed, take them out of bed, walk 10 meters and go back to bed. But we did that 5 times a day. And then the next day or the next week, we could walk 10 meters and do 5 squats and then go back to bed. And we gradually built up. So I think it's about changing in our minds that it has to be intense or it has to be a lot. That's just not true. Does that? Yeah. Now I just.
Perdóname. Yo quisiera que tocáramos un tema. Dentro de las últimas investigaciones se ha tratado mucho en algunas situaciones de neurología sobre el papel de los neurotransmisores. Y cada vez se está cobrando más importancia mirar esa situación de los neurotransmisores frente al origen de la enfermedad y frente al comportamiento de la enfermedad. En la parte de los elementos de salud mental también es claro ese papel de los neurotransmisores, y creo que si nosotros ligamos el ejercicio a la salud mental y a la parte de los neurotransmisores, es importantísimo reconocer el papel del ejercicio aeróbico sobre las endorfinas y cómo esas endorfinas ayudarían en la situación de la parte de la salud mental. Creo que el tipo de ejercicio sí es definitivamente fundamental, porque en este momento estamos hablando de que no solamente tendríamos un beneficio sobre las endorfinas, sino que la persona con salud mental, por las mismas condiciones de su enfermedad, tiende a perder una condición de adaptación al ejercicio, tiene una situación de un desacondicionamiento. El problema no es solamente la obesidad, el problema es sobre la postura, sobre el equilibrio, sobre la resistencia, sobre otras condiciones. ¿Cómo ve usted el papel del ejercicio aeróbico en las endorfinas y el acondicionamiento físico?
Thank you for the question. I have to declare I'm not a neuroscientist, so I struggle discussing the evidence around the mechanisms. Yes, endorphins is one hypothesis, but we have a lot of evidence that even smaller bouts of non-aerobic exercise still have an effect on mood. So we have acute studies looking at the acute affective response, so the acute mood response to a bout of activity. And it's consistent regardless of whether it's aerobic, yoga, resistance exercise, it actually doesn't matter. And so where I think that's important is thinking about the long-term adherence. Now, if we only focus on aerobic exercise, we will isolate people that don't enjoy it and don't want to do it. So I think initially we need to think about what I think of as the gateway, like the entry into exercise, and that's the most important part. So that gateway has to be something that someone enjoys and they're willing to do. I think in addition to the endorphin argument, there are also other types of potential mechanisms. Social, you know, for example, the community that people get, the interaction from exercise. If we think about behavioral activation, giving someone a routine, a reason to get out of bed, to go to their exercise program can be really effective. There's also the sense of achievement that comes from learning something new. You know, one of the most immediate benefits I've seen is working with people with severe post-traumatic stress disorder and using resistance exercise. And I know you mentioned posture, but immediately after that session, you see them change. They're standing differently. And so I think that, yeah, there's lots of potential mechanisms to explore, but there's other benefits outside of the neuroscience. The final comment on that is around another thing that people got excited about was hippocampal neurogenesis and brain-derived neurotrophic factor. Because we know that the expression is increased following exercise. It's also associated with memory and with symptoms. There was evidence that exercise increases hippocampal volume. We replicated that study in young people with psychosis and found no change in hippocampal volume, despite an increase in fitness. So I think it's, you know, the evidence is equivocal around what is the mechanism by which it improves mental health. In summary, I don't think there's a single pathway. I think it's going to differ for different people at different times. I hope that answers. Okay, I think great. So should we have maybe a 1 minute, a few minute break and then come back? Yeah. So I think maybe we give people maybe a 2 minute break and we come back. Yeah, okay. So yeah, maybe, yeah. Or half past.
Don't worry, so you decide.
Okay, yeah, so 2 or 3 minutes.
¿Les parece si tomamos un descansito? Nos hace falta la parte ya, digamos, de la capacitación en la parte práctica sobre SIMPAC. Entonces, no sé, pues para no alargarnos mucho, les propongo que sean 5 minuticos, ¿sí? Como para que se desestresen, ¿sí? Ok, entonces 5 minuticos y arrancamos.
I think I will. So,
Hola a todos de nuevo. Vamos a volver a empezar. Básicamente para que aprovechemos el tiempo y no nos alarguemos, porque como nos falta SIMPAC, sí quisiera que aprovechemos mucho este espacio que nos queda, porque lo que él nos va a contar sobre SIMPAC es muy importante, y además el SIMPAC es un cuestionario que van a ver que es muy sencillo y nos va a contar como toda la historia. Pues básicamente nosotros acá en Colombia vamos a ser la primera institución que vamos a estar capacitados en este cuestionario. Entonces, para que aprovechemos mucho, las personas que de pronto salieron y me están escuchando, no sé si me escuchan, que pueden ingresar y ya voy también por ellos. Entonces, pues ya vamos a empezar con esta segunda parte, que es específicamente sobre SIMPAC.
okay. Welcome back. We're going to get more into the practical component now of the questionnaire together with Olga. Just in 2 or 3 minutes, I'm going to give you a summary or an introduction to why we developed SIMPAC. Okay, so the first thing is to think about what are we measuring when we talk about measuring physical activity. Initially, it sounds very simple. We would wear a Fitbit, or we would ask someone, did you do exercise? But it's actually very, very complicated because there are different types of activity, okay? So the first thing is, what is physical activity? And if we think about this big oval, is physical activity. Right now, I'm standing, I'm walking, I'm moving my arms, that's physical activity. But do we want to measure that in a patient? Maybe, maybe not, okay? Under physical activity, we have what's called health-enhancing physical activity. Think of this like exercise. It's something that we're doing to improve our health. Then within health-enhancing exercise, we have activity that will improve our fitness, and they're different things, which comes back to that neurotransmitter endorphin argument. We may have health-enhancing activity that is a push-up or is yoga, but it may not improve our fitness, but it could still impact our mental health. Within that, we then have to think about the domain or the type of activity. So again, that was leisure time, occupational. We have to think about the intensity and then the total duration. These are all the different factors that we may want to measure with physical activity. Now, one is not better than the other. These are just different things that we have to consider. Now, when we talk about measuring activity, we can be really precise, but really difficult to do. So for example, room calorimetry, we can have this really expensive equipment, put people in a room, measure their gas exchange as a way of measuring their activity. It's not practical. Yeah, we can't do that in a hospital. We can't do that with every patient. We can then move down the list, doubly labeled water, calorimetry. Eventually we get to accelerometry, which is not quite so precise. It won't measure resistance training. It won't measure cycling. but it's an objective measure of activity. And finally, we end up at self-report. Now, the first thing to say is that self-report activity is not, it has limited validity compared to the ones up here, but it is the most practical, particularly when working with patients. This is one example of a self-report tool. This is called the Physical Activity Vital Sign. Doctors like this because it is one question. On average, how many days per week do you engage in moderate to strenuous exercise? So I'll ask you, how many days per week do you do moderate to vigorous exercise? How many days per week? So 0 to 7. You can say that in Spanish because I heard it.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay. Bueno, la pregunta que me estaba haciendo Simon era que cuántos días a la semana se hace actividad física y por cuánto tiempo. Entonces lo que le estaba respondiendo era que pues todos los días, dado que pues me vengo en bicicleta.
My next question is how many minutes?
1 minute, you know, minimum 1 hour.
1 hour, perfect. So we put a 7, we put 60, and then we multiply 7 by 60. Yep, easy. What this allows you to do is to then dichotomize, so split into 2, either above the guidelines of 150 minutes or below the guidelines of 150 minutes. So this is an example of a very, very crude measure of physical activity. It doesn't give us a lot of information, but it's a screening tool. Because if someone is under, we can say they need support. Simple as that. But it doesn't give enough information of all those other things that we spoke about as being important. Now, I won't go into this for too long, but essentially SIMPAC was an enormous project. I have to in particularly mention Professor Philip Ward, who was my mentor, my PhD supervisor, and without Phil, none of this would have happened, and Phil is just there. Although we look like children here, this is a very long time ago. So this started in Padua University in Italy. We had a meeting there. We then met Felipe Schuch from Brazil, and he flew to London and met us for another meeting. And really, we just, you know, the people that it brought together were amazing from all parts of the world, and we're very grateful. This is what the tool looks like. These are the countries that were involved in the validation study. So there were 23 countries, and we recruited 1,000 participants with mental illness around the world. And we validated the SIMPAC against an accelerometer. We have 17 languages that it's translated in. It's all available online. This is the final paper. I think we have 43 co-authors, so again, very appreciative of everyone there, and it is available entirely online. Now, it's my pleasure to give you a rest from me speaking English and to hand over to Olga to talk a little bit about SIMPAC here and what's being done before we go into the actual tool.
Bueno, aquí no me va a demorar mucho para poderle dar todo el tiempo a Simon, pero aquí lo que quiero comentar es nuestra universidad desde hace algún tiempo viene, digamos que, fortaleciendo toda la línea de salud mental desde todos los programas y específicamente desde fisioterapia, pues empezamos a buscar qué instrumentos y también digamos qué intervenciones pues habían a nivel mundial para poder empezar a aplicar. Específicamente desde un ejercicio de pasantía que ahorita Shaida lo mencionaba, ella, digamos que encontró el cuestionario de SIMPAC, se empezó a aplicar, pedimos las autorizaciones con los principales autores, se aplicó en un hogar de personas mayores institucionalizadas. Ese proyecto continuó también con otros estudiantes, de allí sacaron una publicación y a partir de allí vimos, digamos, como el valor que tiene este instrumento que ya Simon nos va a comentar y lo hemos utilizado ya en otras investigaciones. Actualmente nosotros estamos haciendo un estudio acá con la universidad porque nos interesa mucho la salud mental de todos ustedes y también, digamos, de nosotros como profesores. Pero digamos que allí este instrumento nos sirvió mucho para identificar, que como yo digo ya lo vamos a ver a profundidad, por ejemplo, durante el tiempo de la pandemia, cuánto tiempo ustedes estaban durmiendo, cuánto tiempo ustedes estaban haciendo actividad física, ejercicio físico, y un poquito más allá, identificar si había diferencia, por ejemplo, entre hombres, entre mujeres, si tenía que ver, por ejemplo, las actividades que ustedes estaban haciendo en la casa. Y allí encontramos unos resultados muy interesantes que todo lo que nosotros estamos haciendo es para ajustar programas de bienestar de acá de la universidad. Encontramos, por ejemplo, que en las mujeres se hace más actividad física y eso lo tenemos que aprovechar de alguna forma, y en los hombres se están haciendo más ejercicio físico. Eso tiene algunas razones que, digamos, no es porque seamos diferentes, sino que culturalmente hay algunas cosas que se pueden explicar allí. Pero digamos que básicamente eso es lo que estamos haciendo acá en la universidad, y lo otro es que como es la primera vez que lo aplicamos acá en Colombia, vamos a hacer la validación de este cuestionario para que ya lo podamos utilizar sin ningún problema en población estudiantil. Digamos que la intención es poder validarlo primero con la población que estamos trabajando y pues ya seguir posteriormente otras validaciones, y en este sentido pues Simon, que es uno de los autores, nos está ayudando en todo este proceso.
Thank you, Olga. Now, before we go into the tool, I just want to mention it's not perfect. Yeah, it has problems. Nothing is perfect. But one of the interesting things here was that we had so many people involved from different countries. And that led to these really interesting discussions about things that we hadn't considered, and also the different cultures involved. So for example, we had a colleague from Switzerland who lived up to the cliche of being Swiss with timing, and they wanted to account for every minute of every day. Then we had people, for example, from Australia, which I think is probably more aligned with Colombia. It's quite relaxed. That was never going to work. Then we had a colleague from Nigeria who was asking us, well, what about when you're in the farm dealing with the cows or something? And we were like, well, this is, you know, we don't know how to navigate this. So I just have to stress that it's not perfect, no tools are, but it's tried to be as inclusive as we can despite cultural differences. What we're going to do now, together with Olga, is we're going to ask you to pair up with someone on your table. There are 5 items to the tool. We're going to go through the 5 items, but we'll give you 1 or 2 minutes. It doesn't take long to ask each other those questions. And we'll do each question, and then we can report back if there's a comment or question. Yeah. So we'll start with the first item, or the introduction. You can see the Spanish up there. But the first question, the important part, is to just mention that what we're asking about is the past 7 days, the past 7-day period. The other thing I forgot to mention is that SIMPAC was designed to be an interview. And the reason that's important is that we know that people are very, very bad at recalling their physical activity levels. Not just people living with a mental illness, everyone. Okay, the reason we want an interview is that we built in a check in the questionnaire to help make it more valid. And that check I will discuss, but it's essentially these 5 boxes down the side. At the end of the questionnaire, the sum of these 5 boxes should be as close to 24 hours as possible. Again, if you're in Switzerland, you're going to be at 24 on the dot. If you're in Australia, India, Pakistan, it'll be somewhere between 16 and 24, or even higher. And that's okay. That's just what happens. Yeah, so it doesn't need to be exact. The other thing to stress is that this was designed to be used either by exercise professionals or by mental health professionals, acknowledging that the length of time each one has is different. As an exercise professional, if I'm doing an initial consultation, I might spend 20 minutes getting a comprehensive history. A psychiatrist wants to spend 1 minute. So they will use it a bit differently. Yeah, so it's just keeping that in mind. The level of detail can be adjusted. Okay, so first question, we have the introduction. So it just mentions the different types of activities we're asking people to think about. Then we get to question 1, and I don't have the English, but I'll try and remember. Question 1 is designed to provide an anchor for the rest of the questionnaire. So the way it's written, you might think that we're asking for sleep. We're not asking for sleep. We're asking for time in bed. The reason being is that the answer here allows us to work out how many hours in a typical day we have left. So for example, if a patient says they go to bed at midnight and they wake up at midday, we then know that there's about 12 hours left that we have to account for and we have to understand. So that was really the purpose of this questionnaire, partly to understand time in bed, but then also to provide an anchor. Now, I think this one is pretty self-explanatory, so we probably don't need to practice this question. Yeah, I think we'll move on. So I mentioned the anchor. So again, using the example I said, that leaves approximately 12 hours a day out of bed. Out of those 12 hours, how long did you spend sitting, lying down, such as eating, reading, watching TV, using electronic devices? And we have a prompt, which is sitting at work, transport, leisure, or at home. Now, we know from lots and lots of research that people underestimate their sedentary time consistently, everyone. Okay, so that's an important point that we'll come back to. This question here took us, it was incredible how much time we spent debating this question about napping. So I think the word is siesta. The reason this is important, if we think about a patient in hospital, if they're spending a lot of time napping during the day, what they're not doing is attending treatment. They're not in therapy. They're not engaging in social activities. And this is a problem for recovery. So we know that napping is not only difficult for the impact it has on other activities, but also the physical health issues associated with napping. So we wanted to capture that as a target for intervention, so that if we had someone that was napping a lot during the day, we could take action around that. Question 3 is asking about walking. Now, the reason that we've separated the days was again from an intervention perspective. So I'll give you an example. At my hospital where I worked, we had a walking group 3 times a week. So Monday, Wednesday, Friday, the patients would come for a walk. Now, I'm sure you've had the same experience, but when I would interview a patient and say, how much walking do you do? They would go, I don't know. Or they would say, oh, nothing. But I knew that Monday, Wednesday, Friday, they were coming on the walking group. And so I could fill that in for them and discuss that with them and remind them. Also, from an intervention perspective, it gives the therapist or the rehabilitation specialist knowledge about what are the possible times that we can intervene or we can do something. If the only walking the person is doing is while they're in hospital, great, we need to focus our intervention on the out of hospital time. So it lets us shape the intervention we're trying to deliver. Our next question, question 4, is the exercise question. It's the one that we can spend the most time. It can be the most detailed, but again, it depends on how much time the clinician has. So we ask about any activities for exercise and sport. We have some examples. We also have a manual that has culturally specific examples for different countries. For example, Bangladesh, it's cricket and soccer. They're the most important. Australia, we throw in things like Australian football, which you may have seen. It's different to soccer. It's a bit more like rugby, but that's a topic for another day. So different culturally specific activities that we can add. We also ask about which days they have been done. And we end up with this table. Now, again, this can be filled out in as much or as little detail, depending on the time you have. And it's all about getting more information to develop your intervention. One of the key things I want to point out is around bouts of activity or sessions. I'll give you an example of why this might be important. I told that story about a patient who's in bed, and I would go to their room every day, get them out of bed, and we'd walk 10 meters, then go back to bed. Then we might do that 2 times a day. Then we might do that 3 times a day. Each one of those little sessions, we'd say, is a bout of activity or a session. So from an intervention perspective, that might be important to record because it's less than a few minutes. We're not going to say I was exercising for 60 seconds. That's not necessary. So the bouts can be really important. We also ask to rate intensity, a visual analog scale 0 to 10. Again, that's helpful for us to monitor the intensity. It's not the focus, but depending on your intervention, it might be important information. You know, you might have had the similar thing, but a lot of patients I've worked with say, I exercise every day for 1 hour, like your example. But I ask, how intense is that exercise? They say 0 or 1. So we go, okay, we need to use that information to try and increase, maybe shorten the time, but increase the intensity a little bit. And our final question is around incidental activity. So it's all those other activities that haven't been accounted for. This is the most challenging. Statistically, this was the most difficult item, but we knew that was always going to be the case. Now, Olga, is there anything you want to add in Spanish before we give people a chance? Or just, no, if there's anything, because what I'm going to do is give them a chance to fill it out, but just if there's anything Olga wants to say before we have a go. Yeah, is that Dennis? As long as you want, and then we can give people a chance to do it.
Bueno, lo que propone ahorita Simon es que él ya explicó, digamos, como las principales preguntas del cuestionario. La idea es que podamos discutir, no sé si les parece, por mesas, las preguntas para saber si hay alguna duda y que él no las pueda como responder de una vez. O sea, la idea es como mirar que podamos entender las preguntas, cómo se responden y sobre todo cómo se interpreta, digamos, el SIMPAC. Entonces, para que podamos hacerlo por mesas y si hay alguna pregunta, pues que él no la pueda responder de una vez. Voy a descargar acá la versión en español para que la miren como completa, para que la puedan discutir en cada uno de las mesas. ¿Listo?
Voy a apagar la amplificación y él puede pasar por mesas usando los micrófonos. Los micrófonos van a seguir usando con la traducción. Lo que no vamos a tener es... ¿Listo?
Hola nuevamente. Durito. Bueno, ya vamos a ir finalizando. Vamos a dedicar un espacito de preguntas para poder hacerle a Simon sobre, específicamente sobre SIMPAC, si hay alguna duda en las preguntas, en la aplicación. Ahorita, por ejemplo, estaban haciendo una pregunta a la profe Vanessa, si este instrumento se podía utilizar en el contexto hospitalario. Entonces, pues la idea es como que aprovechemos estos minuticos a Simon para hacer alguna pregunta. No sé si alguien tenga alguna duda sobre el cuestionario.
Just say that quickly first.
Sí, mi pregunta era también si este cuestionario se podía utilizar en adolescentes, ya que pues yo he intentado manejar grupos de adolescentes donde la depresión después del ¿qué se llama eso? De la pandemia, o sea, el tiempo que tuvimos encerrados, que ellos no tuvieron esa interacción con sus amigos, ellos llegaron al colegio y la mayoría tiene depresión en este momento. Ellos no quieren hacer actividad física porque quedaron como pegados al computador, quieren tener todo virtual. Entonces, este impact puede servirnos para darle a ellos el conocimiento de que sí es importante la actividad física.
Yeah, the short answer is probably not. We haven't validated it in children. So the youngest participants we used it with were 18 years. One of our colleagues in India was a child and adolescent psychiatrist. And he's really interested in developing an adaptation that would be like a pie graph. And in the pie graph, you would have pictures of different activities that kids do. So sitting at school, in the playground, after school, and they could colour in the pie graph to show how much time they think. So that's his idea about how it might work with children, but I haven't used it and I have no experience with that, I'm sorry. My sense would be that it may be a bit too complicated and may not resonate, but I don't know. You would be better placed to answer because that's who you're working with. Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah. There's just one other thing that I haven't mentioned, which is the scoring. There's two different ways of scoring. So I mentioned before that the 4 boxes or the 5 boxes should add roughly to 24. Now, what we discovered, and we wrote about this in the paper, is that if you add up all those boxes and it's significantly less than 24, then for question 2, the sedentary time question, we actually ignore what the patient told us and we subtract all the other boxes from 24, and that gives the true sedentary time. Not sure if that makes sense, but I will just say it one more time. So we have in this impact, there's 5 boxes, and the 5 boxes should roughly add up to 24 hours. What we know is that people underreport sedentary time. So if you've gone through those boxes and it only adds to, let's say, 10 hours, and they've told you that they spend 2 hours sitting, actually, they're spending 14 hours sitting because the 24 minus 10. I don't know, does that make sense? Or do you want to explain in Spanish, or is that okay? It's okay? Yeah, so we called it the alternative scoring method. And when we looked at the data with the accelerometers, the alternative scoring method was more accurate than the self-report, which is just to be expected. People don't know, they underestimate how much time they spend sitting. Yeah. Happy to answer anything. Yeah.
¿Alguien más que tú?
¿Se ha considerado estímulos sensoriales como, por ejemplo, la música para tener mayor eficacia en el tratamiento de las personas con enfermedad mental, teniendo en cuenta también la actividad física?
Music, art, social connection, it's all important. It doesn't have to be separate. We should be doing, I'll give you an example, the gym we're building for the refugee women. We're also going to be running programs for women who have experienced sexual violence or gender-based violence. We recently had women come into the room to tell us what they wanted. Excuse me. One woman said, we want a corner to be an art space. We want to be able to decorate this wall and do art at the same time as we do a bit of exercise. So we are doing that. We're having a wall where they can decorate. Music, dancing is a key part of it as well. The women from Afghanistan, they don't want to be on an exercise bike, they want to dance. So we're just going to create a space where they can dance, and that's their form of activity. So I absolutely agree. Art, music, social, it's all a part of it. You know, I think we have over-medicalized exercise in a way, which needed to happen to get the recognition within the medical world that this was important, but it's gone too far where we remove context, we remove culture, and it's not fun. In Australia, I have students wearing a polo shirt with a clipboard standing in front of the patient, and it's like, come on, this is terrible. Like, where's the music? Where's the fun? Where are we creating a space that people want to come to? So I think that's all part of it.
Gracias.
Chicos, ¿alguien más que tenga alguna pregunta? Bueno, pues nuevamente, Simon, agradecerte de verdad por compartir con nosotros. Espero que puedan aprovechar mucho esta capacitación que tuvimos, que puedan utilizar el instrumento, pues el cuestionario, y no solamente eso, Simon también nos dejó acá en la universidad el libro de ejercicio físico en problemas y trastornos mentales. Está en la biblioteca, ojalá que lo puedan utilizar mucho. Creo que yo les insisto mucho esto y es un libro que fácilmente no lo conseguimos. Ustedes ya lo tienen acá en la biblioteca. De hecho, les hago una propaganda y es que ya muchas personas de afuera nos están diciendo que van a venir acá a la biblioteca a consultar. Es un libro muy bonito porque ustedes van a encontrar que en diferentes, digamos que condiciones de salud mental, hicieron revisiones sistemáticas y hacen, digamos que toda la propuesta de prescripción del ejercicio. Entonces es interesante que ustedes lo puedan encontrar porque sé que en muchos cursos les van a decir, bueno, busquen cuestionarios o busquen la prescripción del ejercicio en una enfermedad mental o en un trastorno mental. Entonces, pues ya tenemos el libro, que es, digamos que uno de los libros importantes en este tema. Lo otro es que les recuerdo que la idea es que empiecen a relacionar muchas cosas. Recuerden que acá tenemos, digamos que un valor muy grande en términos de actividad y ejercicio físico, pero no separen las cosas. Recuerden todo lo del tema de conciencia corporal, todo lo que ustedes han visto también en términos de corporalidad y corporidad. Entonces no lo separen, sino que aprendan de todo esto y miren cómo lo pueden relacionar, ¿listo? Entonces, pues muchas gracias, Simon, de verdad, porque para nosotros es muy importante tener estos espacios, digamos, de diálogo y que tú puedas compartir con nosotros. Y gracias a ustedes, chicos, por estar acá este tiempo y estas 2 horas y también por las preguntas y por el compartir también con Simon.
Thank you. Thank you. I just want to say thank you to you, Olga. It's been an honor for me to be able to come and spend some time with you, and I hope we can have you visit us in Australia sometime soon. Thank you.
My article. This article is your impact.
That's amazing.
It's a pleasure for me.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I really love that. I'm going to be cheeky and ask you to sign it. Is that okay? Yeah. I'm going to take it home.